Hello everyone and welcome back. We have been making great progress through IFRS 16 leases, and today we are going to focus on the concept of lease term, one of the key components mentioned in the definition of a lease contract. Let's recap the definition of a lease as per IFRS 16. A contract that conveys the right to use of an asset for a period of time in exchange for consideration. In today's lecture, we will zoom in on the period of time that this definition refers to. We are going to explore what this period entails and the components that make up this lease term. Typically, when we lease something, whether it's plant and machinery or a motor vehicle, the lease term is represented in terms of days, months, or years. For example, you might lease a vehicle for 6 months or a machinery for 2 years. In such cases, the period of time is easy to understand because it is tied to the number of days. But as we have discussed before, this period of time does not always have to be based on calendar dates. Sometimes the lease term can be linked to the production capacity or the usage capacity of the asset. For example, you might lease a machine with the agreement that you will produce 1 lakh units and then return it. In this case, the lease term is based on the output rather than a specific period of time. Now, according to IFRS 16, the lease term has 3 key components. The first and perhaps the most fundamental component is the non-cancelable period of the lease. The non-cancelable period is the minimum period during which neither the lessor nor the lessee can cancel the lease without incurring some sort of penalty. Now, looking at the non-cancelable period of the lease, it seems like the period that cannot be cancelled under any circumstances. But practically, there is no such things that cannot be cancelled. No contract is absolutely non-cancelable. While it's true that contracts, including lease contracts, can be often terminated, but there are consequences, usually financial penalties or fees, that discourages either party from cancelling early. Let's clarify this point with a relatable example. When 2 people get married, they make vows to be long life partners. But as we all know, sometimes things don't go as planned and divorces happen. It does not mean the marriage was never serious. It just means circumstances changed. Similarly, in business, we often refer to the contract as non-cancelable, but this does not mean they cannot be terminated. It simply means that if either party cancels the contract early, there will be penalties, there will be consequences to face. So, when IFRS 16 refers to the non-cancelable period, it means the period during which neither the lessor nor the lessee can terminate the lease without incurring a penalty. Even if there is a clause that allows termination with a penalty, it's still considered part of the non-cancelable period. Now, let's look at the more practical example. Suppose you rent a flat for 5 years and your contract includes a 3-month notice period for early termination. This means that even though the contract is for 5 years, both you and the landlord have the right to give 3 months notice to terminate the lease early. In this scenario, the true non-cancelable period is not the full 5 years, it's actually just 3 months. Because either party can terminate the lease by giving 3 months notice. So the non-cancelable period is the minimum time during which neither party can cancel without a penalty. And in this case, it's the 3-month notice period. To sum up, the non-cancelable period is the portion of the lease term where the cancellation without penalty is not allowed. Even if the full lease is for a longer period, like 5 years in our example, the non-cancelable period is based on the minimum time you must serve under the contract. Alright my friends, now we will move on to the second and the third component of the lease term, which deals with the option to extend or terminate the lease. The second component of the lease term is the period covered by an extension option, but only if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise that option. Let's break this down with an example. Suppose you have rented a bungalow for 3 years non-cancelable period, and during this time neither you nor the landlord can terminate the lease without penalties. However, your lease contract includes an extension option that allows you to extend the lease for another 1 year after the 3 years are ended. Now, if as a lessee you are reasonably certain that you will extend the lease for the extra year, then this additional year becomes the part of the total lease term. In this case, your lease term is 4 years, 3 years plus 1 year extension period. However, if you are not sure about staying for the extra year or don't plan to extend the lease, then this 1 year extension period will not be considered part of the lease payment. In this scenario, your lease term is just the initial 3 years. So in short, if you are reasonably certain that you will exercise the extension option, the period gets added to your lease term, and if you are not certain, the extension period is not included. Now, the third component of the lease term is the period covered by an option to terminate the lease, but only if the lessee is reasonably certain not to exercise that option. Let's break this down with an example. Let's say you lease a shop for 5 years non-cancelable period. However, you are concerned whether the new shop might not be profitable. So you include an exit option in the contract after the first year. These options allow you to leave the shop after 1 year if you decide to exercise the exit option. Now, if you are reasonably certain that you will exercise the exit option after 1 year, then your lease term is just initial 1 year, since you plan to leave after that period. However, if you are reasonably certain that you will not exercise the exit option and you will stay for the full 5 years, then the entire 5 years becomes your lease term. So let's sum up the 3 components of the lease term under IFRS 16. Number 1 is the non-cancelable period, the minimum period during which the lease cannot be cancelled without penalties. Number 2 is the period covered by an extension option. If the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise the extension option, this period is added to the lease term. And number 3, the period covered by the termination option. If the lessee is reasonably certain not to exercise the termination option, this period remains part of the lease term. These 3 components together makes up the lease term, and they help us understand how long the lease actually lasts. I hope everything is clear so far, my friends. Alright, my friends. Now that we have covered the 3 components of the lease term, the non-cancelable period, the extension option, and the termination option, let's dive a bit deeper into how we estimate whether to include the extension or the termination period in the lease term. Remember, the non-cancelable period is straightforward. It is based on the contractual terms. But when it comes to the extension and the termination options, things get a little trickier because we have to estimate whether we will exercise these options or not. So here a question arises. How do we estimate this extension option and the termination option? Here is the challenge. On day 1, you might sign the lease contract and you can guess whether or not you will exercise the extension or termination options in the future. Our situation, our mindset, or even the market could change later on. So how do we know if we should include this period in the lease term? Thankfully, IFRS 16 provides guidance. It gives us 4 factors to consider when making this estimate. Let's walk through each of these factors. The first factor is the terms and conditions of the option. The second factor is the leasehold improvement. The third factor is the cost of terminating the lease. And finally, the fourth factor is the importance of the underlying asset. Based on these factors, you can make an informed estimate about whether you will likely extend or terminate the lease. Let's look each factors with examples to bring clarity. Number 1 is the terms and conditions of the option. This factor looks at whether the terms of the extension or termination options are favorable to the lessee or not. For example, if you rent a motor vehicle for $100 per month for 1 year, but you have the option to extend the lease for another year at $50 per month rent. This option looks very attractive. You are paying the half the market rent for the second year. So it is likely that you will exercise the extension option. On the other hand, if the rent stays at $100 per month for the second year, you might think it's better to lease a new motor vehicle instead of extending the current lease. In this case, the terms are not particularly favorable, so you are less likely to exercise the extension option. Then, the next factor is the leasehold improvement. This factor considers how much you have invested in improving the leased asset. For example, you rent a building for your college and you spend $1 million on the renovation, making partition for the classrooms, installing furniture, doing electrical work, etc. Now, if your lease is for 1 year, but you have invested heavily in infrastructure, it is highly likely that you will extend the lease. The amount of money spent on improvements suggests that you are not going to leave after just 1 year. Think about a barber shop. If the barber rents the shop for 11 months and spends on fancy mirrors, air conditioning, and infrastructure, it is unlikely that they will leave after such a short period. The investment means that they will probably extend the lease. Now, the third factor is the cost of terminating the lease. You also need to consider the cost of terminating the lease early, both in monetary terms and in terms of the impact on your reputation. For example, if you run a college and your lease is set to expire in 2 months, but you have 6-month batch of students currently enrolled, it's unlikely that you will terminate the lease and relocate in the middle of the batch. The cost of moving and the reputation risk of disrupting your students' education would make it impractical to terminate the lease contract. Now, finally, the last factor is the importance of the underlying asset. Finally, think about how critical the lease asset is to your operation. For example, let's say you rent a machine that's crucial to fulfilling an ongoing order. If the lease on this machine is set to expire in a month, but you have a 6-month order to complete, it's likely that you will extend the lease to finish your order. The machine is too important to let go. So based on these 4 factors, you can estimate whether you will extend or terminate the lease. Remember, These are estimates based on today's information. Future circumstances might change and you could end up making a different decision down the line. But for now, the goal is to estimate as accurately as possible whether the extension option or the termination option should be included in the lease term. Now, what if your estimates change in the future? What if you initially think you will exercise the extension option, but a year later you change your mind? This is where the concept of remeasurement of the lease contract comes into play. If your estimates change and the lease terms either increases or decreases, IFRS 16 requires you to remeasure the lease to reflect these changes. But we will cover that in some later lecture. Now, let's summarize everything. Today, we have learned about the lease term and how to estimate it based on the likelihood of exercising the extension option or the termination option. We discussed the 4 factors you should consider when making this estimate. And we briefly touched on the idea of remeasurement if your estimate change in the future. I hope today's discussion was clear and helpful. Let's wrap it up here for now. Thank you for your attention and I will see you in the next lecture.